Welcome back to my channel, Love Beyond Midnight. Let's get started.
The moment Isabel heard her husband's laughter echoing from behind the study doors, she knew something was wrong. It was not the warm, genuine sound she had heard on their wedding day, when he had whispered promises under the chapel's vaulted ceiling. This was different, colder, the kind of laugh men share over brandy when they believe no women are listening. She had been walking down the east corridor of Thornwick Manor, clutching the sealed letter from the physician against her chest, her heart pounding with nervous excitement about the secret growing inside her. But now her feet had stopped moving entirely. The study door stood slightly ajar. Just a crack, enough for voices to slip through like smoke. She should have announced herself, should have knocked, should have walked away. But something in the tone of that laughter made her fingers tighten around the letter until the paper crumpled. Her late father had always told her that the truth reveals itself when people think no one important is watching. So Isabel stayed perfectly still in the shadowed hallway, barely breathing, as the autumn storm battered the windows and masked the sound of her presence. "Come now, Adrian. You cannot tell us the marriage is truly that miserable." The voice belonged to Lord Pembroke, her husband's childhood friend. She recognized his nasal tone from the wedding breakfast 3 months ago. "Miserable?" Adrian's voice cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. "That would require me to feel something about it at all." Isabel's breath caught. The letter slipped from her trembling fingers and landed soundlessly on the thick corridor carpet. Then why go through with it? Another voice. Lord Whitmore, she thought. You could have chosen any woman in 3 counties, half of them far prettier and with better connections. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Isabel could hear the crackling of the fireplace inside the study, the clink of crystal as someone poured another drink, her own heartbeat hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it through the walls. When Adrian finally spoke, his words fell like stones into a frozen pond. "She's just a dowry to me, nothing more." The world tilted. Isabel grabbed the wall to keep from falling. The cold stone bit into her palm, it grounding her even as everything she had believed about her marriage shattered like glass. A dowry? Pembroke sounded genuinely curious now, not mocking. Surely the girl has some redeeming qualities. She seems pleasant enough, well-mannered. Pleasant. Adrian repeated the word, as if tasting something bland. Yes, I suppose that is accurate. Pleasant, obedient, utterly unremarkable. But her father's lands border mine on 3 sides. Pembroke. 3 sides. Do you understand what that means? With her family's property absorbed into the Thornwick holdings, I now control the largest unbroken estate in the Northern Territory. The dowry included timber rights, water access, and mining shares worth more than most men see in a lifetime. So it was purely strategic. Whitmore's tone had shifted to something like admiration. I had wondered. Well, the girl is plain enough that I assumed there must be some other reason, but... The word landed like a slap. Isabel had never considered herself a beauty, but plain? She had spent hours preparing for her wedding day, had practiced her smile in the mirror, had chosen her words carefully to be the kind of wife a duke would be proud of. Strategic is precisely the word. Adrian's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had made a sound business investment. Her father was desperate to see her married off. I suspect he knew her prospects were limited. So when I made the offer, he practically threw the estate documents at me. I barely had to negotiate. The men laughed. That same cold, hollow sound that had stopped Isabel in the corridor. "And the girl?" Pembroke asked. "Does she bore you terribly?" Another pause. Isabel realized she was holding her breath, waiting, even though she knew no answer could possibly heal what had already been broken. "I barely notice her presence," Adrian said finally. She stays in her rooms, embroiders, reads, does whatever it is wives do. I maintain appearances at dinner. We attend church together on Sundays. Beyond that, she is simply part of the estate now, like the furniture or the horses. Useful, necessary for producing an heir eventually, but nothing I think about with any frequency. The letter. Isabel looked down at the crumpled paper on the carpet. The letter that would have told him about the child. The heir he spoke of so casually, as if it were another acquisition to be managed rather than a life they would create together. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach. 6 weeks. What the physician had been certain. She carried the future of Thornwick Manor inside her body, and her husband considered her less interesting than his horses. I must say, Adrian, you hide it remarkably well, Whitmore observed. At the Ashbury ball last week, you seemed quite attentive to her. I even remarked to my wife that the Duke of Thornwick appeared genuinely fond of his new Duchess. That, my friend, is called breeding. Adrian's voice carried a hint of pride. A gentleman maintains appearances. Society expects certain behaviors. I play my role. She plays hers. Everyone remains satisfied with the arrangement. Does she know? Pembroke's question was quieter. That it was only for the land? Of course not. Adrian sounded almost amused. The girl is romantic enough. She writes poetry, for God's sake. I found a notebook of it in the library last week. Terrible verses about love and devotion and other sentimental nonsense. She probably believes I married her for some grand passion. It's easier that way. Happier wives make for quieter households. The notebook. Isabel felt heat flood her cheeks. She had been looking everywhere for that notebook, had assumed she had misplaced it somewhere. The idea that Adrian had read her private thoughts, her carefully crafted verses about hope and new beginnings, and dismissed them as nonsense, made her throat tighten with humiliation. You are a cold bastard, Thornwick, Whitmore said, but he was laughing. Efficient, I'll grant you, but cold. Cold keeps you alive in this world, Adrian replied. Sentiment makes you weak. My father taught me that before he died. Every decision is a calculation. Every relationship a transaction. I chose correctly. The estate is secured. The family line will continue. And I am not burdened by messy emotions that would only complicate matters. Isabel pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. 3 months. For 3 months, she had woken each day believing she was building a life with a man who had chosen her. She had been so careful, so eager to please, to become the kind of duchess he deserved. She had memorized his favorite foods, learned the names of all his tenants, studied the history of his family so she could speak intelligently about the Thornwick legacy. And all of it had been for a man who saw her as furniture. The rage came suddenly, burning through the shock and humiliation. It started in her chest and spread through her limbs, hot and clarifying. She bent down and retrieved the crumpled letter from the carpet, smoothing it carefully against her skirt. The physician's words were still there, written in his careful script. Confirmation of pregnancy, estimated delivery in late spring. She folded the letter once, twice, 3 times, until it was small enough to slip into the pocket of her dress. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breath had steadied. And in that moment, standing in the cold corridor while rain lashed against the windows and her husband laughed about her insignificance, Isabel Thornwick made a decision. She would not cry. She would not confront him in front of his friends. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she would show Duke Adrian Thornwick exactly what kind of mistake he had made when he reduced her to nothing more than property and paperwork. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what her father had signed away, and she needed to do it before her husband realized she had been listening. Isabel turned silently in the corridor and walked back the way she had come, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Behind her, the men's voices continued, already moving on to discussions of hunting season and horse racing. They had no idea that the plain, unremarkable, perfectly obedient Duchess of Thornwick had just declared war. The Part 2. The Ledger of Lies. The rain had stopped by the time Isabel reached the manor's eastern wing, but water still dripped from the eaves in a steady rhythm that matched her footsteps. She moved through the servants' corridors, the narrow passages that allowed staff to travel unseen through the grand house. She had discovered these hidden routes during her first week as Duchess, when loneliness had driven her to explore every corner of her new prison. Now they served a different purpose. The estate office sat at the far end of the north wing, a room Adrian visited each morning to review accounts and sign documents. Isabel had only been inside once, on a brief tour after the wedding. He had gestured vaguely at the rows of ledgers and legal files, told her not to worry her head about such matters. Oh, and ushered her out before she could ask a single question. Her hand hesitated on the brass doorknob. What she was about to do crossed every line of proper behavior for a wife. If Adrian discovered her going through his private papers, the consequences could be severe. He could lock her away in the country estate, could refuse her access to their child, could make her life even more miserable than it already was. But then she remembered his voice. "She's just a dowry to me." Isabel opened the door. The office smelled of leather and tobacco, masculine scents that made her stomach turn. She closed the door softly behind her and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. The room was exactly as she remembered it. Dark wood paneling, a massive desk covered in neat stacks of correspondence, and behind the desk, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with ledgers, each spine labeled with years and categories she did not understand. She moved to the desk first, her fingers trailing across the smooth surface. The top drawer was locked, but the others opened easily. Inside, she found the usual items: sealing wax, extra quills, a silver letter opener engraved with the Thornwick family crest. Nothing useful. The ledgers called to her. She pulled one from the shelf at random. Estate Revenues, 1823. The handwriting inside was cramped and difficult to read, filled with columns of numbers that blurred together. She replaced it and tried another. Tenant agreements. Another. Property boundaries. Then her fingers brushed against a leather portfolio tucked behind the ledgers on the bottom shelf. It was newer than the others, the leather still supple and unstained. She pulled it free and carried it to the desk, her heart hammering. Inside were documents, legal papers, and on top, a thick contract bound with ribbon. Marriage settlement between the estate of Lord Charles Pemberton and Adrian Thornwick, Duke of Thornwick. Her father's name. Her married name. This was it. Isabel untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and began to read. The legal language was dense, nearly incomprehensible, but certain phrases leapt from the page like accusations. Transfer of title, mineral rights, water access, timber holdings. Page after page of property her father had signed over, not as a gift to his daughter, but as payment to her husband. And there, near the end, a clause that made her blood run cold. In the event the marriage produces no male heir within 5 years, Lady Isabel Pemberton Thornwick may be set aside. With all properties and rights remaining with the Thornwick estate in perpetuity. Set aside. The words were clinical, legal, but their meaning was brutal. If she failed to produce a son within 5 years, Adrian could dissolve the marriage and keep everything. She would be sent away with nothing. Her father's entire legacy would belong to the man who saw her as furniture. The paper crinkled in her grip. 5 years. She had been given 5 years to prove her worth by producing a male child. And if she had daughters? If she had no children at all? Then she was disposable. Except she was already carrying his child. Yet the secret in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. If she told Adrian now, he would own her completely, would know he had won, would treat her with even more indifference because he had secured what he needed from the transaction. But if she said nothing, she had time. Time to understand the full scope of what had been done to her. Time to find leverage. Time to become something more than a dowry in a dress. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Isabel's breath stopped. She shoved the contract back into the portfolio, her hands clumsy with panic. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by voices. Adrian's voice. He was returning to the office. She looked around desperately. There was no other exit. The servants' corridor entrance was on the opposite side of the room. If she tried to run for it now, and he would see her. She was trapped. The portfolio. She couldn't leave it out. She rushed to the shelf and tried to wedge it back into place, but her shaking hands fumbled, and it fell. Documents scattering across the floor. Marriage contracts. Property deeds. Letters. She dropped to her knees, gathering them frantically as the doorknob began to turn. No time. She abandoned the papers and dove behind the heavy velvet curtains, pressing herself against the cold window glass. The curtains fell back into place just as the door swung open. "I'm telling you, Pembroke, the investment is sound." Adrian's voice filled the room. "The railway expansion will triple the value of the timber rights within 2 years. And your wife's family lands provide the access you need." Pembroke's footsteps crossed to the desk. "I must admit, Adrian, yet it was brilliantly played, though I do feel a touch sorry for the girl." Isabel held her breath. The curtain fabric pressed against her nose and mouth. She could see their shadows moving through the thin material. "Don't waste your sympathy." Adrian's voice was casual, almost bored. "She has a comfortable life, a title, security. Most women would be grateful for such an arrangement. Does she even know how much her father signed away?" A pause. Then Adrian laughed, that same cold sound from earlier. "Of course not. Why would I burden her with such details? The contracts are signed, the property's transferred. What she knows or doesn't know is irrelevant now." Something crashed to the floor. Isabel flinched. "What's this?" Pembroke's voice had sharpened. "Adrian, there are papers everywhere." Her heart slammed against her ribs. On the portfolio, the scattered documents. They would know someone had been here. "The wind must have knocked them loose." Adrian's voice was unconcerned. "The window latch is broken. I've been meaning to have it repaired." Isabel pressed harder against the glass, praying it wouldn't creak, praying the curtain wouldn't move, praying they wouldn't notice the window was perfectly latched. "Careless of you to leave the marriage settlement lying about." Pembroke was gathering the papers. "If the Duchess ever saw these terms, there would be hell to pay." "The Duchess," Adrian said slowly, "is far too meek to ever set foot in this office without permission, and far too simple to understand the documents even if she did. Trust me, Pembroke, I know my wife. She is exactly where I want her. Grateful, obedient, and completely unaware of her true position in this household." The words hit like physical blows. Meek, simple, unaware. Behind the curtain, Isabel felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw. But beneath it, something harder was forming. Something that felt almost like clarity. She had spent 3 months trying to become the perfect duchess for a man who would never see her as anything more than a transaction. She had dimmed herself, made herself smaller, swallowed her own thoughts and desires to fit into the role he expected. But Duke Adrian Thornwick had made one critical miscalculation. He had underestimated her. The men's voices faded as they moved toward the door, still discussing railway investments and property values. The door closed. Their footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Isabel waited, counted to 100, then 200. Only when silence had fully settled over the office did she emerge from behind the curtains, her legs cramping from being held so still. The scattered documents had been gathered and replaced. The portfolio was back on the shelf, slightly crooked. Everything looked undisturbed, except for one thing. On the corner of the desk sat a single sheet of paper that had been missed. Isabel picked it up carefully. It was a letter, half written in Adrian's distinctive hand. The date at the top was from 2 weeks ago. "My dearest Cordelia," it began. Isabel's hand steadied as she read, every word a revelation, every line a confirmation of what she had already suspected, but had been too afraid to believe. Her husband had a mistress, and suddenly, standing in his office with evidence of his betrayal in one hand and the secret of his heir growing in her body, Isabel Thornwick smiled for the first time in hours. Because now she had leverage. Isabel burned the letter. She held it over the candle flame in her chambers and watched the edges curl and blacken, consuming the words meant for Cordelia. The woman Adrian kept in a townhouse 3 miles from the manor. The woman he visited twice weekly under the pretense of business in town. The woman whose name he wrote with more tenderness than he had ever shown his own wife. But Isabel did not burn the letter out of jealousy. She burned it because she no longer needed it. The plan had come to her slowly over the past 2 days, piece by piece, like a puzzle finally revealing its picture. She had spent hours in her father's old study, the one room in the manor Adrian never entered because it reminded him too much of the man whose lands he had acquired. There, surrounded by her father's books and maps, she had found something Adrian had either missed or dismissed as worthless: her mother's family tree, and with it, documentation of properties that had passed to Isabel directly through her maternal grandmother. Lands that had never been part of the marriage settlement because they had never belonged to her father at all. Small holdings, Adrian would have called them. Insignificant. A cottage in Cornwall. A textile mill in Manchester. Shares in a shipping company her grandfather had invested in decades ago. But Isabel had sent letters, carefully worded, signed with her own name, to solicitors, to business managers, to the shipping company directors, who were surprised and delighted to hear from the granddaughter of their founder. The responses had arrived that morning. The cottage could be made ready within a week. The mill was profitable and well managed. The shipping shares provided a quarterly income that would support a modest but independent life. She had her own money, her own property, her own path forward. Now she sat at her writing desk, composing the most important letter she would ever write. Not to Adrian. He would receive only a brief note, delivered after she had already gone. No, this letter was to someone far more important. Her younger sister, Margaret, who would turn 17 next spring. Margaret, who Adrian had already mentioned might make a suitable match for his cousin. Margaret, who deserved to know the truth about marriage contracts and property transfers and men who saw women as acquisitions rather than people. Isabel's pen moved steadily across the paper, her handwriting firm and clear. She told Margaret everything, about the overheard conversation, about the settlement terms, about the 5-year clause and what it meant. She warned her sister to read every document before signing, to keep her own inheritance separate, to never, ever trust a man who valued land more than love. And then she wrote the words that mattered most. You are worth more than what you can bring to a marriage. Remember that. The knock on her door came just as she was sealing the envelope. Come in, she called, slipping the letter into her pocket alongside the physician's note she still carried. It was Adrian. He stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable, as if entering his wife's private chambers was somehow irregular. They had not shared a room since the wedding night, another arrangement he had made without consulting her. Isabel. Her name sounded strange in his mouth, formal. I wanted to inform you that I'll be traveling to London next week. Estate business. I'll be gone approximately 10 days. 10 days with Cordelia, Isabel thought. But she only nodded pleasantly. Of course, husband. I hope your business proves successful. He seemed surprised by her easy acceptance, perhaps even disappointed that she wasn't upset by his departure. He lingered in the doorway, and for a moment something almost like curiosity crossed his face. Oh, you seem different today, he said slowly. Content, perhaps. Isabel met his eyes directly for the first time in their marriage. Really looked at him. Saw him not as the duke she had tried so hard to please, but as the man who had reduced her to a transaction, and felt absolutely nothing. I am content, she said truthfully. I've had time to reflect on my position here, to understand exactly what our marriage is. It's clarifying, actually, to know where one stands. Something flickered in his expression. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of unease. But he recovered quickly, nodding stiffly. Good. That's good. A wife who understands her role makes for a peaceful household. Indeed, Isabel agreed, her smile never wavering. After he left, she returned to her preparations. The small trunk was already packed with essentials. Yet her mother's jewelry, the pieces that had been gifts rather than part of the settlement, her father's pocket watch, the poetry notebook Adrian had mocked, her warmest traveling cloak. And one more thing. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote quickly. Adrian, by the time you read this, I will have left Thornwick Manor. I am not running away, nor am I asking for your permission. I am simply choosing a different path. You married me for land. I understand that now. But what you failed to understand is that I am not land. I cannot be owned or transferred or set aside when I fail to serve your purposes. I am carrying your child, the heir you wanted. But I will raise this child away from Thornwick, in a place where they will learn that people have value beyond what they can provide in a transaction. You may keep the lands, the timber rights, the water access, all of it. I want nothing from the Thornwick estate except my freedom. Do not look for me. Do not send anyone after me. I have my own resources now, my own properties that were never yours to claim. And I have something far more valuable than anything in your ledgers. I have myself back. Isabel. She left the note on his desk in the estate office, propped against the same ledger where he recorded all his acquisitions. The carriage was waiting in the servants' courtyard at dawn, arranged through the housekeeper, who had been her only real friend in this cold house. Mrs. Davies had cried when Isabel explained she was leaving, but she had also pressed a small purse of coins into her hands and whispered, "Good for you, my lady. Good for you." As the carriage pulled away from Thornwick Manor, Isabel pressed her hand against her stomach and looked back only once. The great house stood gray and imposing against the morning sky, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She felt no regret, no sadness, only the strange, weightless sensation of a burden finally lifted. The cottage in Cornwall waited. The child in her belly grew stronger each day. And somewhere ahead, a life she would build entirely on her own terms, stretched out like an open road. But Duke Adrian Thornwick had been right about one thing. Every decision was a calculation, every relationship a transaction. But he had forgotten that in any transaction, both parties had the power to walk away. And Isabel had finally chosen to exercise hers. 6 months later, a daughter was born in a small cottage overlooking the Cornish Sea. Isabel named her Catherine, after her own grandmother, who had been clever enough to keep her properties in her own name. The little girl had her mother's eyes and her father's dark hair. But she would grow up knowing something neither parent had been taught: that a person's worth could never be measured in ledgers or land titles or marriage settlements. That love was not a transaction to be calculated, and that sometimes the bravest thing a woman could do was choose herself.